Well, welcome. We are so excited to have Beverly Buncher with us today. I met her through Rachel Graham, who I've interviewed a couple times on my podcast, who has the Healing Springs Ranch Treatment Center in Texas. And she works and uses Beverly's program, BALM Recovery. And I was totally intrigued. And so I reached out to her. We had a conversation, and we've been on a similar journey, but through a lot of different doors. And I just love that we've been able to connect. And I believe that her wisdom and what she's up to in the world will serve our listening audience super, super well. So she's an author and CEO and founder of BALM Family Recovery, and brings that piece to the table, which is really what we're all about, is helping families and friends learn how to be in the peace, the calm, the thriving in the midst of the disease of addiction. So welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your kind words.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So we always kind of start with, what's your origin story? How did you get to this place, this life calling that you're swimming in right now?
Just lucky, I guess. I was just someone who always loved addicts.
I hear ya.
Many of the guys that I dated had an addiction. And when I met my husband, I said, I can't marry you. You're an active addict. You aren't religious. And I forget what the third thing was. You didn't go to college. The next day he called me up and he said, listen, I stayed up all night studying the Torah. I got my degree, and I've decided he was just like everything I said he wasn't, he became. So nice. And I was just so kind of tickled by that response. And we got to know each other, and he was a wonderful man who was killing himself.
Right.
We dated for about 8 months, during which I was ready to break up every day, and then we got married. And I had this thing, should I stay? Should I go? Should I stay? I called up one of my advisors, who later became a BALM coach. And she said, get out a calendar. And on the calendar, in those days, it was all paper. That was 30 years ago.
Right.
She said, what I want you to do is count a month and then write, how are things now? And then another month, how are things now? And do it for a whole year.
Mm-hmm.
And make a decision that you will not decide in between those months whether you're going to stay or go. Just either stay or go. Okay, so I stayed, and I did that. And during those times when I wasn't thinking about how the hell do I get out of here, because it's a very difficult road to be involved with someone who is actively using, I started to seek help. I found Al-Anon, and I read books. There weren't too many back then, but I did find them. And most books were Al-Anon, now that I think of it. And one of those books, a real old-fashioned book, The Dilemma of the Alcoholic Marriage, I read it thoroughly, and I did what it said. And within a month, my husband got into recovery. It was just 2 pages that I found about a woman who, her husband, every night she would say to her husband, I have dinner for you. And he'd say, okay, I'll be home at 6. And she'd make the dinner, and it would sit there, and he didn't come home till 11 or 12. And she just sat there waiting. And when he came home, she started screaming at him all the way through the dinner. And somebody got a hold of her and took her to an Al-Anon meeting. And they said to her, make your dinner, put it, if he's not home by 6:30, put it in the fridge, go to the meeting, come home, go to sleep, and see him in the morning. The first night that she did that, he woke her up and said, what's going on? And she said, okay, honey, well, your dinner's in the oven, or it's in the fridge. Don't worry about it. I figured you wanted to be with your friends. I'm going back to sleep. And the second day the same, and the third day, he was home for dinner. And the next day after that, he went to a meeting with her. But that was a framework that I could see. It made sense to me that if I would stop being anxious and upset and controlling, if I would just love him for who he is in this moment, that maybe he would decide that was a better way of life than the one he had. And so I did it. And he did. And it was a little different in our house. What I did was he came home one day looking for his stash always arrived at the concierge at the front desk because we lived in an apartment building at that time. And it didn't arrive. And he came up, and I didn't know about these stashes, by the way. He came upstairs and he was just there going crazy looking for it. And finally, he found the bottle of wine or vodka that we had been given. It was the only alcohol we got for our wedding. And we kept it. He didn't drink alcohol. I didn't drink alcohol, but what the heck, just for a moment like this. And we drank it down. And my normal thing would have been to try to get it from him, to yell at him, and instead I just observed. And when he was done, he crashed, and we both went to bed, and then he expelled it. And I watched, and I walked out and slept in the den. And the next morning he said, "Gosh, the room smells. What the heck's going on?" And I said, "Well, honey, last night you couldn't find your stash. You got a bottle of vodka. You drank it down. You woke up in the middle of the night, threw it up all over the floor. And I was tired and it smelled. And I went to bed in the other room because I have to be at work." And he said, "Why didn't you clean it up?" I said, "Well, sweetheart, for one thing, you would never have believed it. This is an unbelievable story that something like that could happen and you don't remember it. And for the other thing, it's not really my responsibility, but I love you so much and I'm going to go to work now." And I threw him an air kiss and then I would leave and it would work. And then day I came home from work, and I don't know if it was that day or a month later. Honestly, it's 40 years ago, 39.
Sure. Right.
But there was a note. It was a long note. "Well, you're right. I have a big problem and I'm going to go get help." And he told me he was in treatment and how to find him. And it was away for a month. I went to the weekly meetings. I went to the education. I can't find my notebooks anymore, but they were filled because that's the kind of learner I am. He came home, and the first year was the first year. He was not willing to do laundry because he couldn't go out in the laundry room and do lines of Coke. And he wouldn't go to family parties because he couldn't not drink, but do whatever he and his friends did. I mean, at our wedding, apparently they were doing lines of Coke.
Okay.
And he couldn't do any of his fun things that he did. So he just pulled out of life. And in the beginning, I was like, wait a minute, this isn't what I signed up for. But then as time went on, I realized this is what he has to go through.
Right.
I realized that by going to meetings and talking to people who explained to me that my job was not to try to control him. Mine was to get into my own recovery, heal myself. And if he doesn't do something and I want it done, do it myself. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot in that first year that carried me for a long time. Since the year was up, that was like clockwork. He was amazing. We had a great run of maybe 12, 15 years and of sobriety and a fun marriage. And we were both working our programs. And then one by one, we got real successful in our careers. And I dropped out first. And they say the family usually relapses first. And that was the case for our family. I was disconnected from recovery. I wasn't doing all the things I knew to do. And before I knew it, this is the other thing I was doing. We didn't have any, I don't drink at all. We didn't have any alcohol in the house. And all the people were bringing us wine. And I was having 2 wines every night with dinner. Within a short while after that, he started drinking and using again. I don't blame myself, but I think it's a contribution. If you're acceptable, decide how important your little habits are.
Right, right.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So when you say your recovery, because I think this was really important for our audience to hear this, is you're not recovering from substance use disorder. You're recovering as someone who loves somebody who is dealing with addiction.
That's right. I have a food addiction also.
Okay.
So I had begun gaining weight, which comes from overeating. So I had my own addiction, but really it was my family recovery, my no longer being in his business, trying to control and fix his life.
Right.
And then our daughter had some challenges and teenage stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it just life unraveled for a while there.
Mm-hmm.
He had a 5-year relapse.
Oh, wow.
And during that relapse, this was the guy who ran treatment centers.
Oh,
And
wow.
during that relapse, the two of us were just in chaos. We were both working these big jobs and in chaos. And then I started to pull myself together. I got a mindfulness coach and started to this mindfulness for 2 hours a day. And so I could get out of that constant crying and being upset and fear and anger. And then I started going to meetings again and got myself a life coach and an infidelity coach. And I mean, a therapist. I needed a lot of help.
Yeah.
Let it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think that's really what it takes. It takes some sort of immersion in kind of rewiring ourselves.
Exactly. And I think that experience of what I had to go through to get my mind back and my self back influenced how I developed my program, because I saw that it just takes what it takes. Some people can just read a book. Some people need to learn ideas. Some people need to be in classes. Some people need to have a coach, a therapist, take for 2 hours a day. I mean, it really.
Yeah. And I think that speaks to this whole notion of creating a hybrid program that works for you instead of a one-size-fits-all, which for so long was the mantra within the recovery community. And what we're now discovering is there are multiple ways that we can find our way to our own recovery. And I think that's really important. What I'm hearing you say, and I'm kind of saying this as a check-in with you, is this is a lifelong piece of work.
Yes, recovery is a lifelong journey. And when people come into the BALM program, which is what our program is called, they study 12 principles of just understanding what is addiction. What does recovery look like for us, for our loved one, and how do you get there? And principle 8 is getting support. And we give like 15 or 20 options, because we don't expect people to stay in the BALM forever.
Right.
Doing for 3 months, 6 months, a year. But they will need some support, whether it's Celebrate Recovery or Smart Recovery, and many others, or AA or Al-Anon. We had a story where one of the moms came and said, my son keeps telling me I must go to Al-Anon because he'll be able to relate to me better. And every time I go to an Al-Anon meeting, all they're doing is crying.
Right.
In BALM, I learned how to laugh again. I learned how to have a life. What do I do? He said, you go to an Al-Anon meeting and you never have to mention BALM because they don't like that. I think you just go and you share what you're learning in BALM and how it's changed your life. And you'll them and it'll help you to hear it. And all of a sudden the meeting will be positive. And she did that.
So powerful. I mean, in the world of business that I roam around in most of the time, the saying is that 95% of your success is directly determined by the community that you surround yourselves with. And so I think that's just true in life. You know, who we set ourselves as an intention to become or be, or so on and so forth. We need to be hanging out with people that are that or are at a higher level than that of consciousness, because that energy, that mindset that goes with all of these things that we're talking about, I think it's important for us to live a thriving life that we're around it all the time.
I agree. I agree.
Mhm. Yeah.
And maybe that's why people get into the BALM and some take their courses, do the work, and move on, and some stay.
Mhm.
And they help others. They become coaches. They
Mhm.
immerse themselves
Mhm.
in a world of what we call information transformation and support.
Mhm. Yeah. I think that triad is really the foundation of it all. Because I remember in the early days for me, it was really gather as much information as I possibly could.
Right.
So I could understand the disease and then the information too about who am I going to be as a mom in particular in this disease from an intentional place. Who did I want to be in this for my son? And then who did I want to be in this for me? And that really was kind of the catalyst to own evolution and transformation.
Right. Absolutely. Until we start to realize that that's what it is, a catalyst, that our loved ones' challenges are simply something that we have to face like anything else, but they do not compose who we are.
Correct.
We are.
Mhm.
And life is much more than that.
Yeah, and I'm wondering from your perspective because this is I've been kind of wrestling with this myself more recently. Is that there are a lot of loved ones, like family members, that love people that have the disease, or friends that are caught in the shame of it
Yeah.
and caught in the stigma of it and the judgment, and they're afraid to reach out and tell other family members or tell their friends because they're afraid that the judgment and the shame is going to come back at them. Like, because we live in this world that why can't you control your son
Right.
or that sort of thing? And so I think that isolates us up in a way absolutely that certainly does not serve. But I think we're still really in the early stages of cracking that shame, that stigma, that judgment wide open so that it is a conversation.
So in the BALM, we have 7 C's, and we borrow the first 3 from Al-Anon. You didn't cause your loved ones' challenges. You can't control them, and you can't control it. You can't cure it.
Mhm.
Whereas the 4th Al-Anon C is you don't have to contribute to it, which is very true. Our 4th C is you can contribute to recovery.
Mhm.
We are really about the family has a huge role to play in making things better, but it's very specific and it
Mhm.
must be well done. And 5th C is our stigma buster.
Mhm.
And that is you are connected to your loved one on a level deeper than their substance use disorder.
Oh, will you say that again? That is just awesome.
You are connected to your loved one on a level deeper than their substance use disorder, deeper than their struggle, than their mental health challenges.
Mhm.
The connection, a bond.
Mhm.
And so many families just melt when they hear that because everybody else is saying, get rid of them, make them leave. What? This is my kid. This is my husband.
Right.
These are people. We don't consider them really, even the word addict. He's not an addict. He has an addiction.
Mhm. 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 Yeah, and that's such a critical distinction. When I've talked about it in the past with some of my friends and clients, actually, I say, look, there's my son who is my son, who is an awesome person, just a light in the world. And then there's my son using. And that is the addict over here. They're completely different things. They're completely different people. And so then learning how to love my son in addiction mode with boundaries, continuing to love him and deliver the message, so on and so forth, but be super clear about what's acceptable, what's not acceptable in my life. That was a bridge to walk and learn and skill up.
Right. Absolutely. And seeing the boundary is something that we do. We call it extreme self-care, setting a boundary. It's really just like, this will work for me. This goes with my values. This doesn't.
Mhm.
And so it's not about them, not making our behavior about them.
Right.
Now, we also teach families leverage that you can negotiate. They want all these things. And we ask every client to make a list of all the things that your loved one wants. They want to come home from treatment. They want to still have their children. They want to have access to a car, whatever it is, just a long list. So what is it that the family and the professionals want? Complete your treatment, go into sober living, go to meetings, whatever it is, make that list. And in order to get some of these things, you need to do some of these things. That's leverage, not manipulation.
Right.
But leverage, and not to be overused.
Right. Right. So as you were talking about that, I was thinking about some of the things that I remember thinking myself, but also I'm reading it in Facebook groups. The terror of my child being homeless. And I think that's a reach for a lot of people to figure out how to navigate that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what we talk to families about is whether it's your kid or your husband or whoever it is. But I'd say most of our families have kids, but I'd say 60% kids and 40% spouses and friends. So we believe in raising the bottom. First, raising the bottom of the family so that they see that when things aren't as bad, that's the time to start working on it. Way before they're out on the street homeless, if you can.
Right.
And to set boundaries before that point, but loving boundaries with options. So you don't want someone to be homeless, but they're in your house stealing your jewels and your whatever it is. And you can't have that either. So you might say, sweetheart, or using on your property.
Right.
So you come up with your list of options. So you're not giving them get out, but rather, sweetheart, I want you here. I really do. But the behaviors you're exhibiting, they're destroying my life. And I value my life. I value my property. And so you have a few options. One is treatment. And I have a few treatment centers for you to look at that are amazing. And one is you could go live on Uncle Tom's ranch for a few years. He's invited you. And the third one is there's a homeless shelter down the street and they have room. So any of those could work, but living here just isn't going to work right now. Now, we don't recommend starting there. We recommend ending there when there's nothing else to do.
Right.
But in order to end there and not keep saying, get out, get out, get out, you have to build up an inner strength and an inner of who you are and what they're facing. And that this is not their problem, it's our problem. And that they will go through stages of change and progress, and so will you. And sometimes you'll lapse just like they will. And that when you let go, you're not letting go of your loved one. You're letting go of your having to have it the way you want it. The outcomes you must have. Because guess what? It just doesn't work that way.
Right. The other thing I think about Beverly too is this was how I framed it, was I needed to learn how to be in the presence of suffering in a way that I didn't suffer. And so to hold the space for my son, even when he was using, even when he was in psychosis, even no matter what was happening, being a loving presence while witnessing the suffering that he was going through, that took a little while to be able to understand that was his journey. And I the way that I framed it was, I was never going to be able to know what the purpose of his journey was. But I knew he had one as well as I have one. And so somewhere in that, I found the peace, I think, as you would say, to allow suffering as part of his journey.
Yes, absolutely. And we are mindfulness-based family recovery program. So we teach our families multiple different forms of meditation, calming breath work, so that they can have this imperturbability growing within them. Because when you are living with someone who's suffering with addiction, you will experience a lot of chaos, a lot of upset, ups and downs. You'll feel like screaming, crying, yelling. And if those are your go-tos, you won't be able to help anyone, not yourself, not them. So we talk about lowering your inner temperature so that, as you said, you can be present in the midst of chaos and suffering without being consumed by it.
Yeah. Which I think in some respects is, we happen to be walking through the door of addiction and recovery right now. But I do think it's a sign of the times that we're in. This is just one red flag that's being waved of the times that we're in. And so everything that you spoke to there, I also think in terms of this is a skilling up for all of us for the times that we're in.
That is so true. When families come into the BALM, they say, boy, I came for my loved one, but it's upscaled my whole life. And the first time I realized that was true, I knew it was true for me. The first time that I saw it in others, one of our coaches, we teach this course called The 7 Steps to Be a Loving Mirror, which is our transformation process. And one of our coaches walked into a meeting with his digital workbook from the 7 steps, and it was frayed on all sides. And he said, see this book? It's my Bible. I live by it. And it was a story about how there was a fight at his office, and he sat down and he had a BALM conversation, which is what we call our process, with his workers who happened to be relatives, and was able to completely turn the tide. They were all able to come back to an understanding. This isn't just for addiction. This is for life.
Right.
That's
right.
More. Absolutely right. It's skills for very difficult times that we're living in.
Absolutely. So the other thing that's rolling around my head is, because part of these difficult times that we're living in, you and I grew up in a time when fentanyl wasn't available. And we are clearly in a pandemic relative to fentanyl. And it has raised the stakes. It has changed the landscape and the game. And so what are your thoughts, in the midst of this part of what's happening?
So overdose has gone down. We saw that study. And one of the things they're attributing to it is that people who use fentanyl are learning how to use it in a way that doesn't instantly kill them. Now, that doesn't mean that it isn't the most horrible drug in the world right now. But that's the evolution of drug use. What would I say? I would say to the families, this is an emergency. If you have someone who's using fentanyl or anything else, you've got to get help for yourself, because it is the absolute, what's the word? It's the absolute symbol of how out of control everybody else is in our lives. If someone's in the clutches of fentanyl, I think it's between them and God. But the family can learn new ways to relate, just as they do for any other problem. And I have someone whose spouse was using fentanyl, and he's now in treatment, and she just never thought she'd get him there. And it's day by day. But yeah, it's the same. It doesn't matter if they're using fentanyl or anything. I mean, whatever it is, the family can contribute by shifting. We call it an attitudinal shift.
For sure.
It's understanding that it's our problem, not theirs, that change happens in stages, learning how to do motivational interviewing with your loved one, not to manipulate them, but to help them think about themselves, learning how to let go of what you have to have without giving up on them or giving into manipulation, and their best chance. And these little quirky things, those are their first 4 principles, but they make all the difference in the world. And the families learn how to be and do that. And the whole family changes.
Yeah. And so there's My brain's one of the things I think about was in the early stages was the sleepless nights of endless worry, that this was going to kill him. And then really truly grabbing a hold of my thought patterns, my emotional patterns, and then therefore my behavioral patterns to change them, because this wasn't serving him, and it was just destroying me. And so taking my life back in the midst of that and getting off that particular part of the roller coaster was really mission critical. And then understanding that Sam's brain had been hijacked by his disease, and understanding as you say, kind of the unfolding of recovery and the ebbs and flows and the stages that you go through is, I mean, Sam's now 16 months, a little bit more than 16 months. And I'm kind of waiting for that 18 to 24 months where I think more of his brain will be back, more of his true self will be back. And we were kind of doing this. He wasn't living in our house. He was living a state away, and now he's across the country. So the skill up for me was to be able to do this from afar.
Beautiful. I love hearing that, because so many people will come in and say, how can I do this? I don't even live with them. I don't see them. It's within you.
Right.
You change so that you can have a conversation that's sane, rational, and loving, rather than, what are you doing now? What's going on? Where have you been?
Mm-hmm.
That's gorgeous.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it is a process.
It definitely is a process. Absolutely. I think it takes regular, consistent work. I have my morning routines, I have my throughout the day routines, and I have my end of the day routines that helps keep me centered, aligned, ease and flow, and in a thriving space, because I have a big life also that I love. And I'm dealing with people that are executives, but a lot of them are dealing with a lot of stuff in their lives.
That's
so. In order for me to show up and serve at a really high level, my program has to be, I choose to have my program dialed in, and it's non-negotiable. Let's put it that way.
Beautiful.
Mm-hmm. So we've covered kind of a lot of ground. So I'm curious, has there been something I should have asked you, or an area that we still would like to give some voice to before we wrap this up?
So I told you they're doing research on and I'll talk a little bit about that on our program. Mm-hmm. And the preliminary research is now finished, and they're finding just what we thought, which is that when people engage with our program, they have greater inner peace. Mm-hmm. They self-report a much stronger understanding of addiction. Mm-hmm. They have access to over 500 interviews with experts, et cetera, and discussions, and that communication with their loved one and their family improves. Mm-hmm. So these are the things that happen in the research. I mean, this is what program's all about, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
But the thing that stands out for me is what we call the BALM conversation. Mm-hmm. We prepare families to be able to have conversations designed to open up the minds and hearts of their loved ones. Mm-hmm. A BALM conversation, it starts inside of you with having a mindfulness practice and being at peace. Mm-hmm. And then you learn how to document what you see and hear without judgment. Just, okay, walked in, fell across the floor, passed out, example. Mm-hmm. Well, and then you learn how to script that conversation, how to have it in a loving way. There's a very specific template, and how to add a boundary or leverage as needed. Mm-hmm. This is the transformation that happens to families. Right. The story about a mom who came into the BALM. Her son was very ill. She was in the 7 steps, working on the 7 steps with her coach, and he had an overdose. And they decided that they would do a family intervention with a BALM conversation with the coach sitting there. Mm-hmm. Mom told him how much she loved him. and what she was seeing and how sad it made her and her concern that she was going to lose him.
Mm-hmm.
And he cried and
Mm-hmm.
said, I've been waiting to hear you say something like that for years. And
Wow.
he stopped using.
Mm-hmm.
Unconditional love is really the answer. The BALM's message. Love is the answer. Peace is the path. And connection is the result.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well said. Well, I generally don't want to end these conversations. So I just want to say how deeply grateful I am for who you are in the world and the work that you're doing and continue to do. I believe it is one of the major threads of transformation for our society and for the humanity, actually. And so deep gratitude for you, Beverly.
Thank you. And to you.